I want to just riff on what you said, this idea of these recent ideas that have become conventional wisdom.
Yes.
So yesterday I spoke at Loyola Marymount University. It's sort of my very low-budget DIY book tour.
On your voice.
Oh, this is my low-budget DIY book tour. And one of the things, I was saying that, the future of newspapers, I think, involves charging for news. And the student said, are you sure? Or how can you sell it? And I said, I'm not sure that charging for news will work. But I'm pretty sure that not charging for news won't work. And they said, how do you know? And I went through some figures that I'll share with you, some of my basic logic. But before that, I said, how many of you are between 18 and 25? They all raised their hands, students. And I said, you're the most desirable demographic for advertisers. I'm too old, nobody cares about you. You're who advertisers want to reach. How many of you have ever clicked on an online ad in the past couple of years? 2 hands. 1, it was an accident. 2, my finger slipped. That's what I say all the time. What's interesting is, on the one hand, a lot of the students seem to believe that advertising would pay for journalism. A lot of ads you buy on a pay-per-click basis. You only pay when they're clicked. And yet none of them had clicked on ads. And one of the things that's interesting that I explore a bit in this book, I guess it's the subtext, if you will, is this remarkable ability of people to believe 2 opposing things at once. Orwell said something very smart about this, but I don't remember what it was. And so two great things in the past couple days that I wanted to riff on for a bit. One was yesterday, the Knight Foundation announced that they weren't funding a PBS show. I think it was NewsHour, I forget. And they said they're more interested in funding innovative journalism models. Well, a lot of the innovative journalism models they're funding have been great for innovation. They have not been so good for journalists. One of the things the Knight Foundation does is it tends to fund journalism models that support free local journalism. And there's a lot of good reasons to do this. But one of the things you have to wonder as a journalist is whether this has anything to do with the large donation they took from Google last year, or whether it has anything to do with the fact that the head of the Knight Foundation is now on the board of directors of AOL, which runs Patch, and there's a very large stake in the future of free local journalism. And you see, on one hand, this is like the brand new future of journalism involves free and Facebook and Twitter and all this wonderful stuff. I won't say I'm the past of journalism, because I hope I'm not. I hope I'm the tradition of journalism. I think the tradition of journalism involves wondering why the head of a charity is also on the board of a private company and how we can serve both interests at once. And I think whether you're asking that question in a newspaper or a blog or a book or Facebook or Twitter, it's an important question to ask. Another thing I saw this morning was a great article in the Columbia Journalism Review about sort of the new, I forget what they called it, the new conventional wisdom, I would say, the future of news, FON. It's about Jeff Jarvis, Clay Shirky, Jeff Rosen, and somebody else. I would call them the 4 horsemen of the journalism apocalypse, essentially. And it just went into how they're saying that the future should be crowdsourced. The future should be citizen journalism. But, and maybe it should be. There's a lot of interesting reasons why that idea has taken hold. It's a very positive idea. And I already, after 2 weeks, I can tell you that the market for positive books may be somewhat better than the market for gloomy books. And it's also this great, profoundly democratic idea. We are all journalists. We are all writers. Who doesn't want to believe that? Yet, there's really very little evidence that this is going to lead toward the kind of journalism that we enjoy now, let alone the kind of journalism we would want. It's really, what I call it, is a faith-based business model. I'll give you an example. Last year, Jeff Jarvis, who I know and I like personally well enough, did a consulting project for the Ann Arbor News. They stopped publishing in print, they went online only. But he said that that was going to stabilize them because they wouldn't bear this expense of printing all the time. A year later, online without those expenses, they had another round of layoffs. In between, they had changed corporate structures in order to break the union. And I think you have to wonder, and I asked Jeff, does this shake your faith in what you were saying? The fact that they had continued layoffs, the fact that it didn't seem to be working. They said, I don't really know enough about it to comment. So he was willing to give advice on a consulting project, but when it didn't work out, he didn't know enough about it to comment. You can draw your own conclusions on that, but to pull back from this and to go into the theme of my book, I think that one of the fallacies of free is the difference between what an economist would call marginal costs and fixed costs. What you might call the cost of writing and the cost of getting it out there, whatever you want to call it. In the past, the cost of getting it out there was significant. You had to have a printer, you had to have a press, you had to have a delivery system, newspaper boys, the whole thing. And that shaped journalism. You had a daily deadline because this was a daily paper with daily delivery. On the internet, that's not the case anymore. You can be available 24/7. You're expected to be available 24/7. And the distribution costs have mostly gone away. But one of the things that hasn't changed is the fixed cost. Newspapers still have to pay people to write the stuff in the first place. And it seems like the simplest thing in the world, but people don't, on a lot of levels, don't get it. People will say, I don't want to pay for a CD, it's free to send me the music. People have said, they don't want to pay for my book, it's free to send. So let's talk a bit about that. This is the most expensive object in mass media right now. It costs $350 to bind, print, and ship a physical book. That's not really that much money compared to the price of the book. People tend to assume that a hardcover book must be way more expensive to produce than a paperback. But that's not really true. It's just what people think because the price is higher. The way they price media is more like the way they price air travel. First class doesn't cost $1,000 more because fresh squeezed orange juice and an extra few inches of legroom is so precious. They want to charge you what you're willing to pay to make up for a high fixed cost. In this case, getting the airline from one place to another. I do the same thing. I mean, Random House does the same thing, but I basically do the same thing. I had a very high fixed cost. It took me a year and a half to write the book. I have to make up that fixed cost. The way they do that is by first seeing who wants to buy it in hardback at a relatively high price, then seeing who wants to buy it in paperback at a slightly lower price. And what's interesting is the technology that lets them distribute this book on the Kindle for free has really not changed that much the process of me writing a book, or I dare say the process of me doing journalism. For this book, I was lucky enough to use a state-of-the-art computer with the best word processor publicly available. I was still looking at a blank screen. Most of you probably have the best equipment you can get. From the looks of the journalism school, how much does that help you write? The word processor doesn't do that much of the work. It doesn't make your phone calls. You now have access to a lot more databases, and that's great. But you still have to know what you're looking for. And you see this play out in all sorts of different businesses. A friend of mine was at a technology dinner, and someone was saying that the music industry is never going to be the same because Abbey Road Studios, where they recorded the Beatles, the equivalent of Abbey Road Studios can now be in every single Macintosh computer. So my friend, being my friend, he's a wise ass, he stood up and said, where do they put George Martin? Who was the Beatles producer. And that gets at the divide. I think you can make a great sounding album on a computer. You don't need a professional studio. But the real question is, do you still need a great producer? You can have journalism, great journalism, without a printed paper. But I would argue you still need a great journalist. Oftentimes you need a pretty good journalist and a pretty good editor, or I don't want to get into this, but some combination of both. I think that, and new media doesn't really correct for that. I mean, there's people who say, we'll put it out there and the crowd will correct us if we're wrong. I'm not sure that most people really want that. But I think the danger is, and where I'm very critical of Google is, a lot of these online business models are really evolving in a way that helps Google. If you want to do great journalism on an ambitious level, maybe not necessarily a local level, but on an international level with bureau chiefs and war coverage and all that stuff that people tend to like, you're going to need a certain amount of money, a certain amount of writers, editors, photographers, etc. It's very hard to pay those people based on the going rate of online advertising. You'll need to charge. Google doesn't like that. They tend to push a vision of journalism where the product fits the package. It's now free to distribute, therefore it should be cheaper to make as well. Because it gives them more space to sell ads. A couple days ago, a professor who was extremely smart, and I thought it was a naive question, but he asked, why do you think Google is digitizing the world's books? What's wrong with a card catalog? And I said, Google can't sell ads in the card catalog. If you're the biggest seller of advertising, or you want to be the biggest seller of advertising, you need as much space as you can get. Newspapers provide space. Google News provides space. They're selling ads against news that other papers report, essentially. And one of the things you see if you look at these businesses, and I wrote about a bunch of them, newspapers, books, music, film, and TV, is that we always tell ourselves the same thing, that these are greedy, old-fashioned executives that couldn't adapt. The guys from Silicon Valley were smarter, and young people know everything and have a different vision for the future. I don't think that's the case. One thing I'll say, at CUNY, I taught at CUNY for a couple of years. The most enthusiastic person about the internet was Jeff Jarvis, because he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars consulting internet companies. Most of the students were worried about how they were going to make a living. I would call that totally reasonable. If you're a student, you want to know what kind of job is waiting for you. If you're a consultant, you feel like the companies who are paying you are extremely smart. This is the way the real world works, kids. And, you know, it's very hard to feel sympathetic for some old media companies. You know, someone asked me, I think yesterday, how can I feel sympathetic for Gannett, given the bonuses the executives got? I said, I'm not sure I feel sympathetic for Gannett. I'm not sure I could feel I'm not sure I could feel that kind of emotion for a corporation, forgive me. But just because Gannett may be greedy and stupid doesn't mean that it doesn't have rights. It doesn't mean that it doesn't generate jobs. Gannett got into the journalism business, or bought its way into the journalism business, bought its way further into the journalism business to make money. They were greedy. That's why they got into business. I don't see a lot of evidence that most people there were true believers, if you will. Their desire to make money led to a lot of good journalism. That's how they made more money, or so they thought at one point. And people tend to realize that. You know, people get into the movie business partly to make money. I don't think Transformers 3 was a labor of love. I'm going to go out on a limb there. At the same time, the fact is, you know, hundreds of thousands of people lined up to see that movie. I wasn't one of them, but obviously they saw something they liked. It had some kind of positive effect. People obviously enjoyed it. We tend to lose that when it comes to the other side. People, you know, really think that Google and Apple are in business trying to improve the world. I think that's really naive. Google is in business to make money. That's good. Their desire to make money has led to Google Maps, without which I would still be on Vermont somewhere looking for USC. Google Search, which is great, but they also lead to some, and a lot of these products help creators. They also lead to some products that don't. Just for example, Google News. Google, if you're looking for something on Google News, they are relying on your content as journalists. They don't pay you for that. Now Google News says, just tell us not to crawl that page, we'll take it out. But that only applies to Google. You can remove yourself from Google. You cannot remove yourself from Google News and stay in Google. Why not? It helps them. Now they would say they started Google to get a range of perspectives and opinions out on the web because they thought that was important for the news ecosystem. If you believe this, please leave journalism immediately. You have no place here. No offense. They did it as a business. It may be a good business. It may have positive effects on the world, but it's a business. And here, they rely on fair use, and that's what I think what they do is legal. That everyone agrees. In Europe, they've gotten sued successfully. They've had to take newspapers out of Google News or be required to pay them a license fee. They don't want to pay a license fee. So I was in Germany a couple months ago, and I asked the Google executive, is this legal, what you're doing in Europe? And he said, oh, it's fine under fair use. So excuse me, they don't have fair use in Germany, so how is it legal here? He said, oh, it's legal in Europe also. I said, at this point, he's getting a little sick of it. Didn't you just lose a big court case in Belgium? It's illegal in Belgium. And he said, and I quote, a lot of things are illegal in Belgium. So if this ends up on YouTube, perhaps I'll elaborate on that answer, but I kind of doubt it. It's not, and the paper, and I was the Belgian newspaper agency whose name I will not even try to pronounce. They didn't want to get off of the internet. They wanted to get compensated for their work. There's this thing, people say, well, don't newspapers want to be part of the future? Or don't record labels want to be part of the future? And I always use this example. Let's say you're selling your car. And I say, I'll give you $500 for your car. And you say, get lost. Google essentially says, what, you don't want to be part of the automotive future? It's not a disagreement about who wants to be part of what future. It's a disagreement over price. And that disagreement over price has become, I think it's become pitched as this great ideological struggle. Because everyone wants to pitch, it's every businessman wants to pitch his pricing dispute as an ideological struggle. Someone asked me, a reporter from the LA Times asked me the other day, why doesn't Google get along with the record labels? And I said, well, why would they? They have oppositional interests. Google wants a low price, the record labels want a high price. If I'm running a supermarket, I want to pay as little for milk as I possibly can. The farmer wants a higher price. No, in the case of the supermarket, I need physical possession of the milk, so it's a pretty straightforward negotiation. In the case of music, it's harder and harder to get people to pay. So everyone's essentially negotiating in public. The implication being, if you won't meet our price, people are just going to take it anyway. I don't think that's much of a market. That applies to news as well. A student yesterday asked me, well, isn't news basically a commodity? And I said, like any great author, I answered, it depends what you mean by news, and it depends what you mean by a commodity. Am I ready for TV or what? So, I said, if you're thinking about news as in an event just happened, there was an earthquake here, such and such resigned, that's a commodity. But I don't think the internet made that news a commodity. I think that's been a commodity for a long time. Serious journalists have not been in the business of telling you what happened yesterday for a few decades. I think what we're doing, and what there is money in doing, and what there is a future doing more and more, is providing context. What will this earthquake mean to this economy? What will that resignation mean to the future of this government? That writing and that analysis, I think, is not a commodity. Because if you look at who's doing it differently, you'll see very differing levels of quality. And I think that saying that's a commodity becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's sort of the negotiation, I call it in my book, I'm okay, you're a commodity. It's basically like, for years, there was a lot of money in the television business. There's was very hard to make a good television show that people would watch. And the prevailing view was that any idiot could make a TV. It was so easy to make TVs that Sony said, the TVs that say Sony, we're going to have them made in China by another company, stick the name Sony on them and send them to America. Because it's not something we really need to do ourselves. Televisions were a commodity. Now, Apple's getting into the television business. They're going to stick an Apple logo on it, and it's going to be a platform. If you want to watch a certain show, you may send your payment to Apple instead of a cable provider. All of a sudden, making a TV is going to be the hardest thing in the world. Only the iGeniuses at the iStore can make an iTV. Television is going to be a commodity. It's just what makes that machine go. And the point of that is, I think that like a lot of what we look at on the internet is an effort to force that other person's product to be a commodity. A lot of people say, why didn't newspapers get together and try to come up with one model where you could pay one price? And my response is, that's an antitrust violation. I don't think the government would stand for that. If you look at what the publishers did in terms of trying to name their price on Amazon, there's now a class action suit that Amazon had a role in inspiring, shall we say. Amazon wants control over pricing. Google wants control over pricing. Google is making it easier to sell newspapers using the Google checkout system. They want to make the Google checkout system as common as PayPal. And I guess the question for newspapers is, if you make that deal and you have a role in making Google checkout the dominant player, if Google checkout replaces Visa and MasterCard, and you had a role in making that happen, can you negotiate for a piece of Google checkout? And I think a lot of newspapers feel a bit guilty about that. I mean, one of the things I get into in the book that everyone has given me a hard time for is I'm very tough on The Guardian, and I'm very, I have a lot of praise for the Murdochs as business people. I happen to like The Guardian. As a general rule, I'm not fond of the Murdochs' view of journalism. Wall Street Journal would be an exception. But it's not really a book about who's doing good things. That's another kind of book. Maybe I'll write one, but that's not this. This is a business book. The Guardian is losing tons of money. So much money that it's not sustainable. The Guardian says, we're going to give away as much content as we can to reach more people and make it up in advertising. I'll talk a bit about why that won't work. This is what I said the other day. In the traditional world, advertising, like everything else, is based on supply and demand. There's a supply of advertising space, there's a demand for advertising. In the traditional world, there was a limited amount of space. If you wanted to create more ad space, you had to start another newspaper or another TV station, radio station. That was expensive. So the supply was limited. The demand was pretty constant. Advertising as a percentage of GDP hasn't changed much since 1955 in the US, and it's pretty similar. From what I'm able to understand, it's fairly similar in most developed economies. So now the internet comes along, and newspapers say, great, we can expand our circulation, we'll get so much more for advertising. But wait a minute, the ad space is now infinite. In the time I've spent talking to you, how many Facebook pages have gone up? They all have space for advertising. The cost of generating those pages is nothing. Meanwhile, how much has the demand for advertising expanded? Given the state of the economy, probably not at all. So what's interesting to me is you have all these very smart newspaper executives, and I'm talking about Alan Rusbridger from The Guardian, who by any measure is just a brilliant guy. He really believes that at some point, internet advertising is going to make up what he's losing on print advertising. And I'm unable to understand how. If you think about what I just said, it's pretty concrete. We all know things are priced on supply and demand. The numbers of the demand for advertising are pretty clear. And you could take some minor exceptions, but I think what I said about the supply of ad space is pretty clear too. So what are you going to do to change that equation? And that's what I mean by a faith-based business model. Because there are so many good things about the internet. I'm not an internet hater by any means. I love me a skateboarding bulldog. You know, I have a funny blog. I say humorous things on Twitter. Maybe not as funny as I think, but a little amusing. But there's this idea that the internet will save all businesses if you embrace the internet. And I think a faith-based business model is a bad business model. If you look what the Murdochs did, they tried to charge for journalism. Whether you like what they're doing or not, that will keep journalists employed. The Guardian, like most people think they do better journalism, but who's doing that journalism? Alan Rusbridger would say, when WikiLeaks came out, we had all these people looking through WikiLeaks. But the story The Guardian's really gotten a lot of traction from this year is ironically about the phone hacking scandal at News Corp. That was mostly the result of one dogged reporter who wouldn't quit. Nick Davies, I think, right?
Yeah.
So, he wouldn't quit. How long did he stay on that story? If you were going to price out the page views for that story, you could never afford, by any rational measure, you couldn't keep him employed. By any journalistic measure, you'd have to. It changed the reputation of the paper. And I think there's a danger there, crowds do a lot of things well. Wikipedia is great, but a lot of it is combing through information that's already there. If you want to have people comb through WikiLeaks, that's a great idea. But if you want to have someone doggedly pursue a story, which I still think is where a lot of great journalism comes from, journalists help a lot. And they could be journalists using cameras or using Twitter or using Facebook or using anything. But the vision that this Columbia Journalism Review article talked about, Jeff Jarvis, Clay Shirky, Jay Rosen, etc., it's not a vision of journalism without newspapers. It's a vision of journalism without journalists. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing. If you look at the Huffington Post, Arianna Huffington talks a lot about the future. Does anyone have a laptop open? You want to look at the top story on the Huffington Post? Give me the top 3 stories. Arianna Huffington talks a lot about the future of journalism. And she says that her implication is that journalists have a very short attention span. They don't go back to stories. When I saw her speak, I think last year, she was talking about the mine collapse and how she was going to stay on that story. The Huffington Post never did a serious piece of reporting on that story after the following week. The New York Times owned that story, and the local paper owned that story. The Huffington Post curated it, and that's valuable. But the idea that she stayed on that story wasn't true. Anyone, top stories? Huffington Post?
Court upholds Obama health reform.
That's a big deal.
GOP candidate calls Elizabeth Warren a socialist. Legendary coach reportedly to exit amid horrible scandal.
Nothing about Scarlett Johansson. It's very unusual.
No.
Look farther down.
Kim Kardashian brilliantly marked. SNL mocks Kim Kardashian.
Rare to see Kim fall so low. I'm surprised. Look, people will say that. My point is, usually starlets rank higher on the Huffington Post. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm not, I don't want to be one of these people whose attitude toward journalism is eat your spinach, it's good for you. Certainly, news is about what people are interested in. By the same token, you do want to create space for one dogged journalist to pursue a story for a long time. You don't want you don't want to give that much space to every cranky guy in the newsroom. I see people smiling. But if it's the right reporter and the right story and you think he has the right instincts, you want to let him go. This model doesn't really allow that. But my great story about the Huffington Post was the most famous story, and I think the iconic story of our decade. How's that? The iconic story of our decade. It was the Huffington Post, and the lead was, what time does the Super Bowl start? Did anyone read that story? No, why were they so interested in that subject? No one? The most popular Google search that day was, what time does the Super Bowl start? The result that came up on top was that story. You're not writing for people, you're writing for machines. That's
Is this a give and take? I mean,
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to take questions.
Are you unaware that the Huffington Post hires an investigator?
Yeah.
Has tried to develop a nonprofit model as well. Has
Yeah.
hired, I believe, 50 different reporters. And on certain stories, including the banking meltdown, I think you could argue that the Huffington Post, and certainly the Iraq-Afghan war, I also appear,
Yeah.
I don't have a conflict of interest here, but I appear quite prominently on the space. I've never had anyone suggest that it had to be about starlets, and the Murdoch papers have made their whole reputation on starlets.
Sure.
Bare-breasted ones, as a matter of fact. That's the basis of the empire. So, but if you look at the impact of Huffington Post, do you think it has been just to celebrate Hollywood, or has Huffington Post not raised issues that the mass media in the main was ignoring?
As a business,
No, I'm just talking about editorial content. If we did not
they do some good content. They do some good
have the
content.
Huffington Post, do you think Obama would have had as much of an opening to an audience? Or?
The Huffington Post does some good journalism. I think as a business model, their business model is based on free content. I think that as they do good, this is what's interesting about the Huffington Post. Arianna Huffington has always said the future of journalism is based partly on crowdsourcing. But everything she's done that's good has come from professional journalists. Now, sometimes those professional journalists were paid by starlit photos. Sometimes those professional journalists were paid by nonprofit. But all that great work has come from professional journalists. And now you have to ask, the New York Times has a hard time making money on online advertising because online advertising won't cover the salaries of their star reporters. Huffington is hiring those star reporters away and paying them way more money. So the question is, does the advertising money she brings in, can it pay for those salaries? Even if it's great journalism, is it a business model that can support that great journalism?
I don't want to dominate, but
no, go ahead.
The advertising model was always flawed. So
of course.
When I worked at the LA Times, I was reminded quite often that the serious journalism we did not sell most papers. It was the horoscope, it was the sports section, the opinion section was a loser. The book section never got any advertising. So it was always a flawed model. What you're arguing, I don't even want to spend a lot of time on Huffington Post, but you argue that she's bringing in revenue on one basis and supporting journalism on another. That's the convention.
Oh, that's not my problem. I think it's unsustainable. I mean, I think that she can't, if she was going to bring in a lot of views with nothing and then use it to support good journalism, there's two issues with that. One is I'm not sure it's sustainable. Two is that I'm not sure the shareholders of AOL have an appetite for that. I mean, the shareholders of the New York Times, because of the way the paper is held, have essentially said, we want to keep doing serious journalism, even if a decline in quality would arguably generate more revenue. I'm not sure that the shareholders of AOL have signed on to that.
Okay, but Robert, hasn't the Times put up a paywall now that's actually beginning to work?
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it does seem to me that the notion that nobody will pay for good journalism is flawed.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I think people are paying for good journalism. I think the conventional wisdom has hardened into this idea that no one would pay.
Right.
If you go back, and I am a little stuck in the past because the book came out, and finished working the book in the spring. But when the Times put up its paywall, Jarvis said it would never work. So many people said it would never work.
Yeah.
My question isn't, why isn't the Times paywall working? My question is, why is anyone still listening to some of the conventional wisdom at all?
Right.
I mean, people are paying, they will pay. And the Times circulation didn't even go down. It was a complete success. And the Times, I think, I almost wonder why the Times didn't do it sooner. I think the answer is the Times has a slightly guilty feeling about commerce.
They did try it earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah, they only tried it for the opinion section.
I think they didn't do it the right way.
No, they
I think
didn't do it
the idea of doing it for opinion
They
was
cut
a
it
bad
out
idea.
because they had a guilty feeling. To hear Tom Friedman wanted to be read famously by kids in internet cafes in Bangalore, and he was worried that a paywall was going to prevent him, so he was against it. So that certainly goes to your point.
But remember that the Times' success here is not just about the paywall, which has operated more effectively than they thought it might, but also about the fact that they've been very aggressive about charging for the print products. So when Dean
Yeah.
Baquet was here 2 weeks ago, he said, for the first time, and this is remarkable, they're actually getting more money from subscribers than advertisers.
Yeah,
You know, all the
But
subscribers.
he
One
also
thing-
noted that that was because the advertising that we
Right.
followed.
One thing I think is important is you
But to
don't
go
want
from 80 to 20 means
you don't
that
want
the album
to
line is-
oversimplify the paywall issue. One of the things you see is that when you make a paper free online, print subscriptions decrease because you're like, hey, I might as well read it free online. If you charge for it online, print subscriptions tend to decrease more slowly. And because print subscriptions still bring in more revenue, you end up ahead. I think that's something that, people tend to think about it as a 2-angle calculation. It's really like a 10-angle calculation. But it's still, you come out ahead.
Isn't that true, like when Apple raised the price of downloads to $129?
They made
They're
a lot
selling
more money.
less, but they're making more money.
They sold 13%. My understanding, and this was an estimation that Billboard used at the time when I was there, they sold 13% less music for an average of 20% more money,
Right.
which is good.
And then another question too, not, this is
Sorry.
wrong, but how did the Huffington Post get those eyeballs and generate that revenue to
What
hire
time
those
does the Super
reporters?
Bowl
In other
start?
words, how they got to that point to be able to hire these people, how they're scraping from other, publications online and using, they're just like Google News, enabled them to get the readership, to get
Yeah.
the profile to actually do what they're doing now.
That's why I'm negative on the Huffington Post. I think they're bad for journalism in general, even though they've done some great things. But I'm not, like, just because I'm critical of them as a business doesn't mean I'm critical of what they're doing journalistically.
So,
Sure.
Hold on, let's get some students.
I'm actually a graduate of the program, the MA program in '97, and since then I've worked in online advertising since kind of the beginning of it, helped invent pay-per-click search, and I've worked at Yahoo for the past 12 years now. I actually know that there is revenue in advertising because
Sure.
I wouldn't have a $1 billion product line to run if
Yeah.
it weren't for people actually clicking on ads. But I just wanted to say, what about niche? A lot of the focus is on niches. So things like Kickstarter, ProPublica, things like that the internet have really enabled, maybe less so in ProPublica, but things like Kickstarter where musicians, journalists, or writers have been able to go and
There's certainly, just to be clear, there's certainly a lot of money in online advertising. The problem is that it's spread so wide.
So more people making less money versus like the old model where you had to be on a music label to make serious cash, but now there's probably more people making living wages versus...
I'm not sure there's more. I think there's more people making a non-living wage.
Or
If you look at, I looked at the Department of Labor statistics. There are fewer musicians employed now than there were a decade ago. There are fewer people who say their profession is a musician than there were a decade ago. So when people say there's more musicians making a living, that's very hard to measure. I wouldn't say that's the definitive statistic, but I tried my best to get a definitive statistic, and it said there's fewer people supporting themselves. I think what happens is people have in my opinion, people have an idealistic vision that this is going to be like let 1,000 flowers bloom, but you're cutting it into such small slices that it's very hard to keep going. I think niches you can run on advertising.
Well, yeah, so one of my friends is a writer and with a major publisher and all that. He said he benefited way more by being on Fresh Air and having his interview replayed 3 times, sold him way more books than getting a good review in the New York Times. And that pretty much supported him for the past year. And one of the things was because people were able to go and instantly buy his book on Amazon, download it for the Kindle, and they were willing to pay for it because Terry Gross made it sound so good that they actually did pay the $14.
Oh, yeah.
So.
But I think that, I would say that's not unlike what I'm saying. I mean, obviously, like when as someone who's promoting a book, I want to be all over because that's why people buy the
And
books.
to the right audiences, too.
Yeah, and I want to, NPR listeners buy a lot of books. That's sort of the book business. The question then is, are people paying? The question in my mind is, are people paying for that book, and are they paying enough that will let you work on a book for a couple of years?
Right.
And I think that it's in the interest of authors not to let Amazon fix the price of books in a way that benefits them. And some people say, well, And that doesn't mean that Amazon has the wrong price or publishers have the right price, but when Amazon was essentially tried to fix the price of books at $10, it was in an effort to sell enough Kindles that would let them monopolize the book business.
And that's the lost leader right there. Like they sell the Kindle for below what it costs.
Right, and I would say that I'm not sure that I want to be Amazon's lost leader unless I'm getting a share of what they're using books as a lost leader to build an empire. I wouldn't want to be a lost leader unless I get a share of the empire. And I think that's probably not coming. And the other thing is just to talk about Kickstarter a bit. I think one of the things with books, with any of these things, books and record labels, it's not how much money you get, it's when you get it. Like a lot of people said, wouldn't you want to sell a book on a Kindle for $10 and you could go right through Amazon and make $7 per book? That's almost twice as what I'll make on a hardcover. And the answer is, in my case, no, because first of all, the publisher will give you an advance. I'm not sure what I would live on for 2 years under an Amazon deal. And the other thing is publishers amortize risk, in that if 1 out of 7 books makes money, and the 7th book that you write makes money, on a publisher, you can still have a decent career. If you're doing it all yourself, you'd lose a lot of weight, at the very least.
Or if you have credibility, though, with Kickstarter, I recently participated in a Kickstarter campaign because I knew that the person writing it has credibility.
Yeah.
I knew I liked their past products. So, the book wasn't, I paid my $50 and I got the book like 7 or 8 months later when it actually came out, because he used that money to write the book and get it published.
I don't know what to think of Kickstarter. I like it for music. I'm a bit nervous about it for journalism because I'm a bit afraid that it becomes a way to peddle influence. You know what I mean? Like, there's certain people who agree with me have offered me all sorts of opportunities to make money in ways that I feel uncomfortable with, so I've politely turned them down. I wonder if that's a good idea in terms of journalism, but I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I'm just not sure how it would work.
Any other questions here?
I was under the impression that the Huffington Post actually usually relies on free content from their writers, that they fired a whole slew of freelancers. So won't this business model work as long as people are basically willing to work for free?
The Huffington Post is a complicated beast. I mean, there's a couple of different things that they did. They have a lot of bloggers who are blogging for free. Is one sort of chunk of content. Another chunk of content is they have a lot of relatively junior journalists summarizing stories from other publications. That's a second chunk. A third chunk, which is smaller from a business perspective, but most significant from a social perspective, is they've hired a lot of marquee names to do very serious reporting. So it sort of depends which Huffington Post you're talking about. I would say the numbers that made AOL buy the Huffington Post for $315 million are based on the first chunks of content, not the third. What's desirable for most of us is the third, but I'm not sure that the Huffington Post is a sustainable business if they're paying so much money for expensive journalism. But I think you disagree.
Go ahead. First of all, I just want to tell you, I downloaded your book on Kindle.
Awesome.
It's $13.95, but it should be $9 something. But I think the assumption of Huffington Post, and I don't really want to waste my time on Huffington Post. She can defend herself, but I can tell you I've been writing from the beginning, and every time I'm on it, which is every week, my Amazon numbers do go up.
Right. And
I'm doing it to do her a favor, and frankly, and you mentioned Columbia Journalism Review, Victor Navasky, who's been running it, he used to pay me at the Nation magazine, and if he gave me $50, it was a lot or something.
Right.
So I want to separate the question, if we can move it on a little bit, and say, forget about business models. What's good for democracy? because that really should be the main question we ask about journalism. After all, it's in the protected in the Constitution.
Right.
It's assumed to be, and the free press that was protected in the Constitution was one of citizen journalism. I mean, Tom Paine did not take a journalism class.
Right.
It was a course of here or something, and the whole idea was the penny press, the town crier. You can find some publisher to publish your broadside. So it was a notion of an extension of speech. And what happened to media became enormously concentrated in the business model and excluded vast areas of concern. Certainly the whole economy, if you go back, I don't want to visit that subject, but look at what happened to our economy, it was not reported in the main by the mainstream media. They celebrated the worst of it. That was certainly the truth. Most war and peace questions and things. So I would say from a democracy point of view, I don't think we've ever had a more vibrant expression, just looking at it objectively. I mean, Noam Chomsky can write something, and boom, there's people all over the world reading it. You can have Occupy Wall Street, and suddenly people all over the world. I think they even had to ban in China now the reference to Occupy. I just read that yesterday. So there's this incredible force been unleashed, and if we look at it not from the sustainable business model, so then your legitimate question would be, well, okay, who's going to do what you call the calling and the dog or something? I think in the main it's been done by people who felt the need to do it. Much of our good journalism came from nonprofits, from small ventures, from wealthy people who supported good, including mainstream papers, the Oaks or the Sulzbergers or the Grahams or others. And I think what the internet does, and my real concern is whether the internet gets to be controlled the way it is in a totalitarian country or whether that's dark. But as long as it exists, and this is why we defend Huffington Post, what she managed to do was change the national debate. She took on the drudge position. After all, the internet was thought to be leaning right. Ariana came in and had moved herself on the right, and she said, no, we can pull it back in this direction.
I'm not sure. Well, there's a lot there. One is the tradition of free speech is a little more complicated. You're right, but there's also, Justice O'Connor also said that copyright is the engine of free expression, because by providing a market for your expression, it gives you the incentive to produce and disseminate expression, and that's part of the tradition as well. So you do have a right to get paid for your words. I think concentration of power is a bit of a separate.
You have a right to get paid for your words, and why do we have all these bloggers that are willing to work for free? That's kind of what you're.
That was my next question. Is I'm not sure. Ariana Huffington does not meet my definition of someone on the left. I think she's exploiting people. I mean, to me, Ariana Huffington. My idea of being a progressive is things like minimum wage and labor standards. Ariana Huffington seems to have a very differing view of that. The other thing is Ariana Huffington also provides a forum for a lot of lobbyists to masquerade as journalists. I mean, there's a lot of banking lobbyists on the Huffington Post who are writing about the importance of, if you look at the Huffington Post, you'll see Russell Simmons writes a column. Russell Simmons has been against banks. He's against banking fees. Russell Simmons also owns a debit card business. It charges $1 per transaction. And she gives Russell Simmons a forum to essentially promote Russell Simmons' take is basically, I don't want anyone else to exploit the poor, that's my job. And by giving them a forum, that is a vibrant, in a way, that's a vibrant democracy. But I think it's also a bit of a democracy of hucksterism. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I mean, I wouldn't stop him from doing that. Is it good that he's doing that?
As a blogger?
Can we move beyond the Huffington?
Yeah, sure.
I have a different question. I'm clearer on what you don't think will work. I'm clear on
So am I.
feeling that Jeff Jarvis is wrong. Although I think you're wrong to confer on Jeff Jarvis the conventional wisdom thing, which you sort of seemed.
No, it's an easier.
He was against the paywall. Not everybody thought it would work. But I guess my question to you is, and so what? I mean, you don't think Alan Rusbridger has it right? If Rupert Murdoch has it right, it may be partly because the Wall Street Journal has been more niche in the past. It was able to get paywalls going when others couldn't. What should journalists who'd like to be paid do?
Well, I mean, not to be wise, but charge. I mean, if you want to be paid, you do have to charge. I think that, look, I mean, the one thing I will say is, and I don't mean to use a lot of this, it's not 100% clear what will work. It is 100% clear what won't work. And I think people who are doing what won't work need to start trying things that might work as soon as possible. I think that charging is a great idea because it changes your incentives. All of a sudden, instead of having an incentive to reach as many people as possible, you have an incentive to do something worth paying for it. That's a very powerful incentive when you think about it. And the second thing is I think that there's other businesses newspapers could get into. I think that, selling what?
Like the Washington Post.
Water, right, that's a whole other thing.
I don't know where you're going with that.
No, but in Europe, you see a lot of newspapers do online commerce. In the Süddeutsche Zeitung, there's a DVD of the Month Club. I think that could be a good business.
Well, the Financial Times does research for corporations.
Yeah. Depending how you do that, that could be a very good business.
So if you think that people should be able to charge for their writings, are you neutral about how those charges will be done? I'm sort of surprised that you haven't mentioned micropayments or collectives like ASCAP or a variety of mechanisms.
I get it.
I think, do you have a point of view?
Yeah, I think micropayments, generally speaking, don't work well. I think that ASCAP blanket licenses, people would call that, and cable systems tend to work well. One of the things that you see is the more opportunities you give to people to pay for stuff, the more they question whether they want it. It's often easier and more efficient and better for business to let people pay once and get all you can eat. If you look at the cable system, very few people question their cable bills as they go up and up. Arguably they should, that's another situation. But people are much more willing to pay $65 for everything they can watch on cable than they are to buy $65 worth of iTunes.
But that behavior seems to be changing with iTunes, and I'm not a huge iTunes person either, but just saying with the demographics of it is that the younger demographic areas seem to be more willing to pay for things, and especially apps and iTunes, like piecemeal, because the subscription models like Rhapsody and all that have not taken off as much as the pay-as-you-go.
Yeah, I think that
So we've probably got time for one more question.
the average iTunes user spends less than $100 a year. In fact, significantly less.
I think spends less than $100 over their life as an iTunes.
Significantly less.
I mean, way less. I think that the iPad, I'm not sure that it depends on demographics as much as platform. The iPad is a very good platform for commerce. When I'm on the iPad, I buy a lot of stuff because it's so easy.
Buy through Yahoo Live Stand, just launched this week.
But the other thing is, while the iPad isn't, while it's a micropayment in some ways, it's not a micropayment in other ways. And that I don't have to enter my credit card information each time. It's all in there already. I think that's very important. I think generally speaking, people are not price sensitive, they're convenience sensitive. Charge what you want, but make it as easy as possible.
Last question here from the audience. Are we good? Okay. All right. I want to thank Rob Levine for. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks all for coming. Okay.